Thomas Jefferson was considered the most notorious of the founding fathers of the United States. He wrote the draft of the Declaration of Independence of the 13 colonies. As president, he doubled the territorial extent of the United States and founded a political party that dominated for 28 uninterrupted years. His face adorns American coins, stamps, and bills. Today we will look at the life and work of a man who made a mark on the political life of the United States. This Virginia native cut taxes and government spending, imposed embargoes, created a military academy that would train soldiers who would be deployed from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. He was the first Secretary of State of the United States, and in his homeland he amassed fortunes thanks to agriculture, the slave trade, and a network of business relationships with merchants and smugglers. I'm Jose Ricardo Calvo. Welcome to the New Encyclopedia. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, in the British colony of Virginia. He was born into a very wealthy family of plantation owners and slaves. When his father died, Thomas was a teenager and inherited a large amount of land and many slaves. Among those lands was what would later become his main residence, the Monticello plantation. Having inherited land, slaves, and money, Emma Jefferson quickly developed a lifestyle with expenses exceeding her income and accumulated debts as a result of the constant remodeling of her houses on the various plantations she owned. This, coupled with her expensive wardrobe, was a constant source of headaches for both him and his family. Despite her extravagant lifestyle, she projected herself as a cordial person, and cleverly used that image to sell herself politically to the voters of the British domain in America. In the later Continental Congress, and later as a diplomat, legislator, merchant, and president. Not worrying about money, Thomas Jefferson constantly expanded his knowledge in all areas of learning. He studied law at the College of William and Mary, where he would meet George White, an intellectual and academic who was his mentor. Like him, he would share correspondences that would influence his future. In his free time, when he wasn't debating with other British aristocrats about philosophy, theology, wines, or politics, he would invent things. Among them, the first pivot reclining chair with wheels, a crude precursor to the ones we use every day for work. Polymathic and polyglot, Jefferson was a restless man who spent long hours writing and reading correspondence, absorbing like a sponge all the knowledge he could. Likewise, he amassed a gigantic library, cultivated every variety of vegetables and fruits he could at Monticello, and enjoyed the dynamics of business. After graduating as a lawyer from the most prestigious and expensive university in his state, he began practicing in multiple courts throughout the mountainous state of Virginia. He married his third cousin, Martha, and started a family. And while Jefferson was enjoying the benefits of married life hundreds of miles from his native Virginia, some men on the Boston Pier disguised as American Indians began to throw all the boxes of British tea from the docked ships into the bay. A violent war was about to begin. A war that would change the world as we know it. What started as a dispute between bar owners, lawyers, and printing press bosses with the British government in Boston over tariffs and taxes they found arbitrary, became a matter of concern for all the colonies when England decided to tax the American colony to be able to fight the wars with France. This form of financing made imports such as cotton, sugarcane, wool, tobacco, and the paper have a dramatic increase. Likewise, the authorities of the British domain in America had the power to take the crops, fruits of labor, slaves, and other properties of taxpayers if they considered it necessary for the war effort. For men of Jefferson's time, who were nourished by the novel ideas that came from all over Europe, the notion of such arbitrariness was a great contradiction that bordered on the sinful. When England passed the Intolerable Acts Law, which harshly punished all the colonies for things that only the Bostonians did, all the colonists were upset and united in a circumstance that had never united them before. In this way, this conflict escalated to the American Revolution of Independence. Jefferson joined this cause by writing a series of pamphlets explaining that the British colonists were loyal to the king and not to Parliament. Initially, the sentiment of the colonists was that the king was poorly advised. But with the increase in repression, that opinion quickly changed with the Second Continental Congress. The Continental Congresses began as a series of forums where the landowners and leaders of the 13 colonies debated what should be done about the excesses of Great Britain. Personalities of the time such as John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington participated in these meetings from the beginning. Thomas Jefferson, for his part, would join later, participating in the Second Continental Congress, while John Adams was the one leading the independence movement in the Continental Congress, already assembled in Philadelphia. In the corridors, they commented that it was necessary to write a Declaration of Independence in case the majority decided to take that great step. So John Adams and Benjamin Franklin got the task from that group to write that document. John Adams would give Thomas Jefferson the honor of writing the draft of the Declaration of Independence. According to John Adams' biography, written by David McCullough, he gave Jefferson 3 major reasons to write the draft. The first is that Jefferson, as a Virginian, had the right to be one of the first to take an interest in this matter. Adams was perceived as abrasive, suspicious, and unpopular, while Jefferson was viewed as the opposite according to Adams. Lastly, Adams admitted that Jefferson was a superior writer. Adams' flattering bet was based on the fact that Jefferson, being a prominent Virginian, would drag the rest of the leadership of his territory into the independence struggle. Jefferson spent the next 17 days finally writing a draft that would later be edited by others and would become the fundamental text that governs the United States. Then he wrote the Declaration of Independence. As a war revolutionary, Jefferson was briefly the governor of Virginia. Since the British were bypassing this, he was removed from power. He was then re-elected to the Continental Congress and developed the process by which all future states would be created from federal territories belonging to the government. Let's remember that the American Revolution was an uprising of the upper classes, and Jefferson was part of these castes. It was a philosophical revolution, and Jefferson was an avid scholar of the discipline. In his political imagination, the intersection of the economic and the ideological was the perfect environment for Virginians to be drawn to it. For Thomas Jefferson, anything that could be interpreted as an undermining of liberties was unacceptable. Taxes, the presence of British troops, trade tariffs, the disposition of territories west of the colonies, and relations with native tribes. All of these were seen as key power factors that London could take advantage of and that Jefferson thought were prerogatives of the Americans. In 1784, the Continental Congress decides to send Thomas Jefferson to France as part of a diplomatic mission comprised of Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, who had negotiated the end of the Revolutionary War. Franklin, already advanced in age, would die just 6 years later, and John Adams was later sent to England. So Jefferson essentially became the United States ambassador to France. As a diplomat there, Jefferson accomplished more for himself than for the United States. He built relationships with smugglers, aristocrats, and liquor dealers, commercial relationships that would be of great value throughout his life. Without the public office, he couldn't have made those connections. While Jefferson was conducting personal business with a diplomatic credential in Paris, the United States was mired in debt as a new nation, and few countries wanted to establish commercial relations with them. And while the various states of the Union were settling domestic policy issues, the government had not yet been able to organize a cohesive foreign policy thanks to the vagueness of the founding documents that governed the legal framework of that nascent republic. So each state of the Union sought to do business with different countries independently and without any kind of executive oversight. At that time, each state in the United States was competing with each other for resources, recognition, and trade. There was no kind of governmental cohesion, So Jefferson, in the absence of guidelines emanating from the government, devoted himself to rubbing elbows with the aristocracy of the French Revolution. He was a close friend of the Marquis de Lafayette, a French aristocrat and nobleman who left lands, wife and children to go fight the Revolutionary War in America and returned to his homeland victorious and very wealthy. From that friendship would emerge a small detail. Jefferson helped Lafayette with a draft of what would later become the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. On the other hand, Jefferson couldn't believe that after that French Revolutionary period, everything would end under the horror of the guillotine in the time of terror. He was horrified when his friend Lafayette, for example, was thrown into a dungeon. Thomas Jefferson resided in the lavish Hôtel Languillac in the Elysian Fields, leased from Duke of Orléans, Louis XVI's cousin. Once there, he brought his daughter, whom he would put to study at the prestigious nuns' college of the Abbey of Pantamon. His daughter would attend classes with Josephine de Beauharnais, the future lover, wife, and empress of Napoleon Bonaparte there. At the Languillac Hotel, he used his slave James Hemmings, whom he paid for culinary studies, to later employ him as head chef at the Monticello plantation, and Sally Hemmings, a slave girl who was the half-sister of Jefferson's wife. Yes, in other words, Jefferson's father-in-law had an extramarital relationship with a slave, resulting in Sally, whom he kept in slavery, serving his wife Martha until his death. And then she became the possession of Thomas Jefferson, who began a sexual relationship with her. Thomas was 30 years older than her and impregnated her 5 times. In fact, of the 600 slaves that Jefferson had throughout his life, he only gave freedom to 5, and all were Sally's children. Upon arriving from France in 1789, in what he thought would be a short vacation, Jefferson found that George Washington had been elected president, and he asked Jefferson to be the country's first Secretary of State. This was Jefferson's awaited opportunity to stop serving his country and start shaping it. There he began the phase of nationalist politician, and after encountering the disillusionment of political rivalries, he decides to found his own movement and political party. However, once inside Washington's cabinet, Jefferson was basically snubbed and ignored. He was the lone voice of opposition, and as he was not a good speaker, he focused on the work of a political operator. In addition, he ran into his nemesis in the cabinet, Alexander Hamilton. He would lose several political battles to him, such as the founding of a national bank, staying neutral in the French Revolutionary War, and the issuance of debt bonds. The only political battle that Jefferson would win against Hamilton in the cabinet was deciding the location of the country's capital. They chose to erect what would be Washington, D.C. in a swamp on the border of Virginia. The Jeffersonian Republicans were the opposing force to Hamilton's Federalists. He sought alliances with James Madison, a congressman from Virginia, and a senator from that same state, James Monroe. The political machinery of the Jeffersonian Republicans founded newspapers in service of their cause, which they would later use to discredit their most staunch opponents. At one point, Jefferson hired journalists in the State Department who would then use their salary to finance anti-federalist pamphlets. The construction of partisan press was a common thing in both sides, but it was Jefferson who made the greatest investments to cultivate a cohort of flatterers from the press to favor him in public opinion. That's how in 1792 Jefferson retired from the State Department and decided to dedicate himself completely to the organization of the Republican Party. In 1796, Washington announced his retirement from the presidency, which led to new elections. The competition between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson didn't go in his favor. For Thomas, in a tough election, 71 electoral votes measured Adams's victory. At that time, the system made the losing candidate take the vice presidency, so those 4 years as vice president were a game of shadows and silent and conspiratorial opposition. Perhaps one of the most brilliant displays of political cunning from Jefferson emerged in response to the package of alien and sedition laws that Adams and the Congress of 1785 wanted to pass. These laws were an arbitrariness and an abuse of power, as they allowed the government to imprison journalists and anyone who wrote and published text against the government management. Jefferson and Madison teamed up to make an even more unconstitutional response, because they were the intellectual authors of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. These argued that the government did not have the powers to override the laws of the states. Jefferson believed that a local law could override a federal law. Although at the time these resolutions did not make noise, they would later be of great political credit to the Virginian landowner. In 1800, Jefferson again faced a quite rough electoral contest against John Adams. The Federalists accused the Republicans of being traitorous anarchists, while the Republicans said that the Federalists were aristocratic monarchist bankers seeking the establishment of a civil kingdom. Jefferson beat Adams and another Republican named Aaron Burr. This candidate came in second in a tie that had to be resolved by the House of Representatives, which was in the hands of the Federalists, and which Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson's old enemy, motivated to vote for him since he considered Burr worse than Jefferson. March 4, 1801. The author of the Declaration of Independence assumes the U.S. presidency in Washington. Jim Ronson had to address the issue of the unstructured Western territories. Many Americans wanted to set up shop separately in these territories. To the north, on the other hand, was British Canada, to the south was Spanish Florida, and to the west of the Mississippi, everything belonged to Spain. Likewise, Spain controlled New Orleans, an entry point to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. A geopolitically relevant area that was even a matter of national security for American vessels, as all the colonies west of the Appalachian Mountains depended on the Mississippi for trade. So any foreign nation capable of cutting off passage through that place was a threat to American stability. On the other side of the world, France had been at odds with the rest of Europe for more than a decade. In 1800, Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor, and the Napoleonic Wars began, creating opportunities and dangers for the United States. Jefferson's presidency had several milestones, but one of the most important was the purchase of the Louisiana territories in 1803. In 1800, Napoleon signed a secret treaty with Spain. The Iberians would keep some territories in Italy, and France would keep Louisiana. That is, everything between the Mississippi, Texas, the Rockies, and Canada. That was the French territory that Spain acquired as a result of the 7 Years' War. Napoleon saw the Louisiana territories as fertile ground for building his new empire, and wanted to send troops to develop them. However, a series of storms delayed the departure of his troops, and then a slave revolt in Haiti diverted those troops to that country. So, in 1803, Napoleon needed money to fund his wars in Europe, and so he decided to sell the Louisiana territory to the Americans. The Americans wanted to buy the territory for the tentative offer of $15 million in exchange for more than 2 million square kilometers of land. That is 3 cents for every 4,000 square meters. At that time, the United States government was selling land to its citizens to develop in the West at the price of $2 for every 4,000 square meters. The Paris Purchase was all profit. Now, was that purchase legal? While the Republican Party, the same party of Thomas Jefferson, argued that the presidency only had powers explicitly described in the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson disregarded his doctrine and, with the advice of James Madison, sent James Monroe to France to negotiate. And within a year, the deal was done. On December 20th, 1803, the Louisiana Territory became a part of the United States. No one at that time could have any idea of the magnitude of the real estate transaction that the American government made at that moment. It was the largest peaceful land acquisition in history. The government would commission the famous explorers Lewis and Clark to conduct the cartographic studies and determine where the flow of the Mississippi began. The Louisiana Purchase guaranteed his re-election. In terms of foreign policy, Jefferson fiercely defended the trade of the American Merchant Navy, which was being ravaged by Muslim corsairs in the First Barbary War, a military event in which, by Jefferson's order, the Marine Corps played a decisive role in securing the passage of American vessels through the Strait of Gibraltar and the African Mediterranean. From these events, coupled with those of the war with Mexico, would arise the verse of the Marines' hymn that goes, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, We fight our country's battles in the air, on land, and sea. Thomas Jefferson's second presidency was not as comfortable. He had to deal with English, Spanish, and Muslim pirates who captured and attacked ships on trade routes. So, advised by James Madison, he decided to pass the embargo law against England and Spain, blocking all commercial activity with those nations, which resulted in an economic catastrophe not for the sanctioned nations, but for the United States itself. Trade declined, farmers had no one to sell to, dispatches ceased, and American merchants who had enjoyed years of trade relations went under. Smuggling into Canada became a big business and the country was on the verge of insurrection. Jefferson was forced to repeal this embargo at the end of his presidency to make things easier for his successor. Jefferson retired from the presidency in 1809, leaving a nation in financial ruin, but that doubled its territorial size. That is, it was a mixed legacy. He'd split his time between his Monticello plantation and Washington, District of Columbia. Towards the end of his days, Jefferson was in debt and had very little to leave to his heirs. His health began to deteriorate due to horrible rheumatism in his arms and wrists. His urinary and intestinal system began to fail, and by July 30th of 1826, Jefferson was agonizing from fevers in his bed. Surrounded by friends and family, he died on July 4th of 1826 at the age of 83. By chance, his adversary, John Adams, passed away hours later. Diplomat, revolutionary, polymath, and politician, Thomas Jefferson's diverse legacy forms the backbone of the American state. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe and share this video with loved ones if you enjoyed it. Appreciate your support and see you soon.